I would like to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Sean Ngo. He is the CEO of VF Franchise Consulting, and with his background and many years of experience in franchising and proven track record of helping companies expand into Asia, he is uniquely qualified to tell us why you should consider expanding your brand into Southeast Asia. So now we would like to hand things over to Sean.
If you are based in Asia, I know it is a little bit late, and we appreciate the time and effort that you have made to join us. We do have quite a few number of attendees tonight. If you are in the UK, in the US, and Canada, and perhaps other parts of Asia, good morning to you. So, now we are going to talk a little bit about why you should consider Southeast Asia for your next franchise expansion. And thank you, Alan. You've done a wonderful job of detailing the intricacies of the legalities of franchising laws. I know it is very, very difficult to be covering so many countries in Southeast Asia, but you did a wonderful job, and we look forward to more questions at the end of this presentation, where you can ask both Alan and myself any detailed questions. So a little bit about myself. I was born in Vietnam. I left Vietnam when I was 6 years old and lived in the United States for many, many years. I am a Vietnamese American, and I've been back in Asia for 15 plus years. My previous life was in finance and marketing and real estate. I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I moved to Seattle to work for Microsoft and other companies there. It's interesting that I ended up doing franchising. How I got into franchising was I helped the franchisee who brought in the first American burger chain called Carl's Jr. to Vietnam. So I was on the franchisee side, and I was there helping it, helping to bring the brand in as well as operating it for a couple of years before establishing the franchise consulting business here. I've done a lot of different things, including lecturing as well as project management to real estate development. But obviously, our main task at hand and the main focus of our company via franchise consulting is in the franchise industry. As anybody who has been based in Asia knows, in Asia you have China, you have India, and then of course you have an area or a region called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We call it ASEAN. In short, I know many Americans and people in the West call it Southeast Asia. We are talking about the same 10 countries. Some of them are larger than others. So we're going to, as we go along this presentation, talk a little bit more about the demographics of this region, what makes it interesting for particular brands, and especially brands from the West, and the opportunity for franchising, in each of these countries as well as a region as a whole. As you can see from this chart, you can see that the population of the 10 countries stands at about 650 million people. In 1980, it was about 350 million people. So the population growth rate started off right around 2%, and kind of averaging and leveling off at 1%. For your perspective, developed markets like the UK and the US are growing at approximately 0.5 to 0.6%. So, the rates in ASEAN is approximately 2x what it is in many countries in the West. You can also see here on this slide, the population and what it looked like in the year 2000, and more importantly, what it looks like today in 2018. Again, this is a population pyramid for the entire region, and you can see that it was a very young region. It still is a very young region, and you can see that that shape of the bell curve showing that even today into 2018. One of the questions we always get asked is the capabilities and the talents of the people within ASEAN. Each country is quite different than the other, but you can see here some historical data from the year 2000 to 2017, what the adult literacy rate is. Going from Brunei, which is about 97%, to Indonesia at the same, and pretty much many of the countries within ASEAN are around the 95 to 97%, which is actually quite high. In the U.S., of course, it is a significantly more developed market, but even then, the adult literacy rate, according to some sources, is at about 99%. So just a tad higher literacy rate. From an economic perspective, you see here that the top 10 economies in 2018, obviously on a nominal basis, the U.S. continues to command the share of the pie, followed quickly and with a fast-growing China at about $13 trillion. And you can see ASEAN there standing at approximately $3 trillion, standing in fifth place, which is interesting because, as we all know, the economic and demographic shifts are in motion, and countries like India will be a top three economy by the year 2050, and even Indonesia, which is one of the 10 countries within Southeast Asia, and a country that we will continue to talk about in later slides, will be the fourth largest economy by the year 2050, according to Goldman Sachs. So, and not on this slide, you will find that Goldman Sachs also predicts that the Philippines will come in at 19th and Vietnam will come in at 20th. So you're going to have three Southeast Asian countries all in the top 20, and certainly ASEAN as a region will be ahead of both Germany and Japan and stand in fourth place after China, the US, India, and ASEAN. So quite fast and substantial growth. This is how the GDP is broken out over the years between the different countries. Clearly, Indonesia continues to grow, and with a substantial population and economy, that is only going to grow significantly more. Thailand continues to be second in place along with the other markets, but you can start to see some of the shifts already, where economies like Indonesia will continue to grow, and economies like the Philippines and Vietnam will, over time, due to their substantial populations in each country, will continue to drive the economy in ASEAN. From a GDP growth rate perspective, I have a chart here that looks at the average between 2000 and 2018. Obviously, some of the more newer emerging economies like Laos, like Cambodia, like Myanmar, with a whopping 10% annual average over the last nearly 9 years. And even places like the Philippines and Vietnam continue to get very, very high growth rates. And as of recently, it's probably been more the likes of Vietnam and the Philippines and Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos that have been experiencing the most growth in this region. And also from an FDI perspective, you can see that FDI was, not insubstantial at 42 billion in 2005, but of course it has almost 4x that in the year 2018. And there is a lot of FDI that is coming from places like China, from within the region itself, obviously from more developed economies like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan and Hong Kong, etc. So there is a continued rise in FDI, and each country is slightly different. But for the most part, a lot of that FDI is going into places like Indonesia, like Thailand, like the Philippines, like Vietnam, and to a lesser extent, some of the more emerging economies within Indochina. And one of the key statistics about the region as a whole and the presence that it has, not only within the business community, but from a global image perspective, you can see that tourism through international arrivals is off the charts. It certainly is. Thailand leads the way with nearly 40 million annual visitors. It is, an enormous growth in 2018 versus 2010. You can also see that enormous growth in countries like Vietnam, which had a paltry 5 million visitors in the year 2010, and now it's over 3x that in the year 2018. So a similar trajectory for places like Indonesia, and to a lesser extent, places like Malaysia and Singapore also continue to drive tourism for the foreseeable future. By far and large, we would expect that Thailand continues to dominate the region as a whole from an international visitor tourism market, followed along by countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. And one of the questions we always get asked from people and franchisors who are not based in Asia, not based in Southeast Asia, is really how wealthy is the country and the region as a whole. And this chart kind of shows you, to some effect, what that looks like. Here we are looking at the amount of population, the percentage of population that lives below the poverty line, and you can see the dramatic improvements from the year 2005 to 2017. That percentage is negligible in places like Malaysia. What you find is many of these countries are hovering around the 10 to 12, 13%. The only exceptions are Myanmar and the Philippines, where there is a little bit of discrepancy in the wealth, but clearly, we are seeing improvements all across the board. Now, 10 to 12% or 15% may seem high, but if you look at places like the US, for example, the latest statistics show that approximately 12% of the US population is living below the poverty line. So it is a challenge for every country, whether it is developing or are already developed. And so we can see that ASEAN as a whole has done a fairly good job of reducing that number to where it is today. And one of the big surprises that people probably are not familiar with is the amount of internet subscribers and how networked Asia as a whole is. And also that is being reflected in throughout the countries within Southeast Asia. You can see here internet connectivity is as high as 90%. In markets like Singapore and Brunei, but also, hovering, many of them are hovering around the 70 to 80%, including countries like Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam and Thailand. So there is enormous growth here. And it is an important statistic because a lot of the franchises that seek to enter this region will find ways to do perhaps marketing differently, to find ways to do delivery of products and services differently because of this high internet connectivity. And the fact is, virtually almost everybody owns a phone, a digital phone, or some sort of internet connected device. And speaking of that internet connectivity, you can see here figures from Google and Bain showing the size of the internet economy within ASEAN today in 2019 versus what it could be in 2025. And you can see here, places like Indonesia are just off the charts. Within a matter of 6 years, they're going to go three. They're going to grow 3x, right? And that's just amazing. And that 3x factor is also applied not only to Indonesia but to places like Thailand and Vietnam as well. And so, if your business is internet capable, if you can make your businesses digitized to its maximum, I think Southeast Asia will be the right economy to be able to leverage that capability and that competency. How that market shapes out, how that $300 billion breaks out in terms of e-commerce, in terms of online travel, and the Ubers of the world, the Grab taxis of the world, and the Gojeks of the world from Indonesia, and of course online media as well. So this Southeast Asia boom in digital marketing, digital economy continues to grow at a factor that is significantly higher than what you would see typically in the West. Now we're going to go into some of the countries and do a brief review. I know there is a lot of information here. It is not meant for you to read it, nor for me. I don't think you would enjoy that. But it is there, and like Robert mentioned, we will be providing you with a copy of this presentation so you can dig into each country's profile a little bit further. We have provided a few key comments about specifically for the franchise sector within each market. And first is Singapore, not because it is the most important economy in Southeast Asia, but it is probably the one that most people outside of this region are familiar with. Singapore is by far the most developed city nation within this 10-member ASEAN community. Their GDP per capita is off the charts. It is something where it would rival some of the biggest cities and most prosperous cities in the U.S., in the UK, in Europe, anywhere in the world, right? GDP based on purchasing power parity per capita is about 94,000 US dollars. That's based in US dollars. And so, from economic standpoint, everything about the society is very developed. And if you've ever visited Singapore, boy, it does not look like Asia at all. It looks like a very beautiful, newly made city anywhere in the world, and the shopping centers and the modern retail are just incredible. Singapore, of course, has one major issue, and that is a very small population. It is estimated to be around 6 million people who currently reside in Singapore. Approximately 4 million of those people are Singaporeans, and another 2 million expats, foreigners, and a little bit of migrant workers who work there, in the city state where they need and continue to do improvements in infrastructure and real estate developments, etc. So a very big portion of their population is in fact imported every day into places like Singapore. From a franchising perspective, Singapore punches well above its weight. There are over 600 franchise systems, and well over 35,000 franchisees throughout the little island. And you can see that franchising takes shape in all forms and factors, from F&B to education and training, retail services, health and fitness and entertainment. So all those things and more. And Of course, I'm not going to be talking about any legal issues, but at a very high level, the franchise laws in Singapore, they have none, and it's a fairly straightforward country, despite the number of legalities, related to IP and some of the other stuff that Alan mentioned earlier. But in general, Western companies and companies seeking to enter Singapore have had few problems doing so if they wish to. One of the key things about Singapore too, though, is a lot of brands look at Singapore as a potential beachhead into, predominantly a Chinese population, right? A Chinese speaking, but also everyone is fluent in English because it is the official language and a requirement, from K to 12. And they're looking at places like Singapore and Malaysia as a beachhead to prove their concepts and to potentially take it to mainland China. And that would be the key benefit of going into either of these countries. And a lot of times, franchises will want to get into Singapore because there is a lot of visibility, there is a lot of branding. Singapore attracts a lot of visitors from a tourism perspective. And so it is marketing that can reach not only mainland China, but throughout Southeast Asia, and even some of the other tiger economies in East Asia, like Taiwan, like Korea, and of course, Japan, etc. The one negative about Singapore is that it is very, very expensive to have your business there. The labor costs are the highest within the region. The real estate costs are off the charts, and they're probably only going to lose to places like Hong Kong, which are even worse. But it is a little bit later. We'll see a brief slide that shows you some of the rental rates in Singapore, in places like Singapore, and you know they're really no comparison in around the world. And so yes, there are some benefits to bringing it to places like Singapore. It is a great market, but obviously there are costs to establishing a business in Singapore. And the fact of the matter is, the market is quite small. So if you're looking for substantial growth, you will need to look at other places as well. Now, the next country that we're looking at is Malaysia. And Malaysia as a whole is the second most developed economy in Southeast Asia. And the GDP is nearly $1 trillion, and a GDP per capita of about 29,000 US dollars. So, again, a very wealthy economy within Southeast Asia. The population age is relatively young, but like similar to Singapore, it is getting older. So it's one of the two or three markets within Southeast Asia where the consumers and the people are aging and showing their age a little bit. English capacity in Malaysia is quite high, but again, the official language is Bahasa. But most Malaysians that we have ever met speak multiple languages, including English and Chinese, and possibly other languages as well. They also have a very developed franchising sector that contributes significantly to the economy. 30 billion ringgit. Just so you know, depending on the foreign exchange, $1 may equal anywhere from 3 to 4 ringgit. I think currently today is probably closer to 3 ringgit than 4 ringgit. And very similar to Singapore, You can see that all the franchise sectors are well represented in a place like Malaysia. If you are in F&B, getting halal certification is an absolute necessity unless you are only targeting the Chinese and non-Malayan communities in that particular country. But more often than not, you are and your target market will be a broader range of people within the economy, and thus halal certification is necessary. Some of the key cities include Kuala Lumpur, and also in the state of Johor as well as Penang. And so those are typically the cities and regions that most franchisors, when they enter Malaysia, will enter those markets first before treading out to other areas. Now, I know that Alan ran out of time speaking about Malaysia and some of the franchising laws. Malaysia is a country that has not only the additional IP and all the other laws that Alan spoke about, but they also have specific franchising laws. And unfortunately, in our experience, the laws in Malaysia are quite onerous. And so if you are keen in getting into Malaysia, there are some things you need to do right away. And one of them, of course, is registering your trademarks as soon as possible because that period of registering not only your trademarks and franchise agreements and documents and FDDs can be a lengthy process. So, I've always recommended to groups that probably one of the first things that you need to do is make sure that your IP and trademarks are protected, or at least get the registration process started. And companies like Telec, who has helped many of our clients as they explore expansion into this region, have used Telec and have been happy with the services there. And again, one final comment about Malaysia, and that is again, it is often seen as a beachhead into mainland China. And sometimes what you find is when you find a franchisee that is interested in either Malaysia or Singapore, oftentimes they want to do both markets. And so that's something to take a look at as well. And the next economy is by far and large what every single one of our clients, from Ace to Little Caesars Pizza, to Della France, to all the education brands that we currently represent, to even services brands like Shore Clean, which is in hygiene and disinfection. Everybody is looking at Indonesia, and there's a good reason. The GDP is off the charts, at 3 trillion US dollars as of 2017. Again, I mean, Goldman Sachs expects this to be the fourth largest economy by the year 2050. So it is by far the most important country within ASEAN and will certainly be in the driver's seat when it comes to the economy. The population is also quite large at 267 million. And that little chart there, pyramid showing the age brackets of the population. Again, a very young population with a healthy population growth rate. The main language here is Bahasa. There is some English capabilities, but clearly not as well developed as places like Malaysia and the Philippines. And it is a Muslim country, right? So it is predominantly a Muslim country. So again, if you are in F&B, halal certification is absolutely critical. And again, because of the size of the economy and the fact that GDP per capita is quite healthy, you find that many American and British and European, as well as Australian and Asian brands are found in this particular market. There are franchising laws in Indonesia. based in our experience of being in this region for nearly 15 years, we find that the franchising laws are manageable. So they're not onerous like they might be in some cases in places like Malaysia. The key cities are huge. Jakarta is the prize. If you look at Metro Jakarta, there's probably a good 30, 40 million people around Jakarta. So it is quite a region. But there are many, many other cities that you would eventually expand to, places like Surabaya, Medan, and even the island of Bali. And so again, it's not only these four major cities and regions, but it's certainly these often tend to be the primary focus of franchisors first entering the market. In Thailand, again, and Alan, of course, is the expert in this, but you can see that the franchising sector is also very, very developed. Currently, today, it has the second largest economy, GDP at $1.24 trillion. From a GDP per capita perspective, it is the third wealthiest country within Southeast Asia. And if you've been to Bangkok and to other places in Thailand, you will find some of the most modern retail establishments in the world, very luxurious. It is the envy of many many countries, to be honest with you. Even as you just arrive into Thailand and go to their international airport, it is just it is something to envy, and rightfully so. It is a very it is a young population, but it is getting a little bit older. But one of the key things is that it's been one of the bellwethers of the economies and the growth of the region, and it has a sizable population of nearly 70 million people. One of the key things about Thailand too is when franchisors go to Thailand and find the right partners and franchisees and investors there, um, many countries in Indochina look up to Thailand. So places like Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, because they all share a similar culture. Brands that do well in Thailand are often favored by investors and franchisees in these other three countries. So it could be a beachhead to these other three countries as well. And so Thailand has done an incredible job with that, and you can find that some of their biggest franchises locally grown in Thailand. You will find many of them in places like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos as well. And then this chart here is for the Philippines, and arguably has the most developed franchise industry within Southeast Asia. Certainly one of the largest, with over 2,000 franchise systems, contributing, a core, 25 billion US dollars to their GDP in 2018, a massive amount, and much more than what you find in other countries. Again, everything about the franchising industry is developed. And one of the key things too is that consumers and investors and franchisees are very pro-Western. They attribute a Western brands with higher quality, higher success rates, and you can see an abundance of Western brands throughout the Philippines. In addition to the many, many local franchise systems that they have in the Philippines, and some of the largest F&B conglomerates originate from the Philippines. Groups like Jollibee, which some of you will know is one of the largest, or has is one of the largest F&B groups, not only in Asia but worldwide, and brands that have purchased, even American brands like Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf, Smashburger, and other regional brands within Southeast Asia. No franchise laws in the Philippines. Metro Manila is the place, although there are other big cities, Davao and Cebu as well. And one of the unique things about the Philippines too is just the massive amounts of Filipinos overseas. The diaspora is well over 10 million. And in places like the US, it is in the millions. And so, with that massive amount of Filipino diaspora, what that means is remittances from overseas Filipinos are very, very high, contribute significantly to the country's GDP, but also not only from a financial perspective, but just the filtering and the bringing back of experiences and expectations and understandings of different franchise systems and brands. All that has helped the Philippines to become the powerhouse that it is within the region. Now we're only about a few more slides, probably 6, 7 slides left. So we're going to try and power through this over the next 5 minutes or so. So the next slide is Vietnam, where we are based. We are based in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Again, a country similar to the Philippines in terms of GDP per capita and overall GDP. Even the population is very similar, whereas the Philippines has over 105 million people. Uh, the Vietnam has close to 100 million people at 97 million. And the franchise industry, I wouldn't say is in its nascent stages, but it certainly is growing and growing very quickly. So again, lots of franchises in the different sectors. Um, there is a franchise law in Vietnam, but it is not onerous. It is very, very manageable. And in fact, Telek and Gibbs has helped many franchisees and also our franchisor clients for their legal needs when it comes to Vietnam specifically as well. Vietnam, like the Philippines, is very pro-Western, and again, to a slightly smaller scale, but still significant, a very large Vietnamese diaspora. That again bridges the cultures between different countries, whether from Europe to the West in the U.S. the Americas, to places like Australia, etc. So that has, and very similar to the Philippines, helped the country acclimate to a more international environment. And one of the key things about Vietnam too is they have multiple cities that are substantial in size. Ho Chi Minh City is considered the commercial capital, sometimes called Saigon. It has about 10 million people. Hanoi is the capital, and that has about 8 million people. And all the other cities you see there are well over 1 million people each. Da Nang, Haiphong, and Can. And brands as they enter this market again usually enter in these cities in this order as well. And then quickly, this is Myanmar. Again, a nascent industry. There are some franchising activities here. A lot of it is in F&B. Brands like KFC and the pizza company. The pizza company is from Thailand, and the franchisee there used to be the franchisee for Pizza Hut, as some of you know. Bread Talk, Gloria Jeans, many different types of hotels, a lot of education and training brands for children, and also that cater to English language learning, etc. No franchising laws here, but we are very, very bullish in Myanmar. It is obviously has lower economics, but certainly with a sizable population and similar in size to Thailand, many people are very bullish on the fact that over the next 5 to 10 years, this could be a very, very good market. And the same thing with Cambodia, again, a nascent industry, but quite efficient and quite successful with the brands that have entered Cambodia. And you'll find the likes of Starbucks, Krispy Kreme. Every time we are in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, people are always asking us about can we get them the next McDonald's. So it's a very fun conversation, and you can see that the population here is very, very young, with about 17 million people, but lots of growth, lots of opportunities. Reminds me of Vietnam, probably at the most 10 years ago. So very, very good market, very good opportunistic market. And the same thing with Laos, a little bit less developed than Cambodia and Myanmar, but similar in size to Singapore at 7 million people. But there are brands there already, brands like Texas Chicken, which, as you know, in the U.S. is called Church's Chicken. And again, you can see Korean brands like Lotteria and the pizza company there as well. Now, I haven't really spoken to you about the elephant in the room, and it's we probably should cover it very, very briefly. I know you see this in the news day and night. I will make it very brief. This is an update according to the World Health Organization for every country within ASEAN. And you can see the total number of cases, the new cases, the total number of deaths. And what you can extrapolate from this is that there are a few countries in this chart that are doing a fantastic job of managing the situation and are close to winning. I wouldn't say anyone is winning, but certainly if we refer to the term flattening the curve, from the countries Thailand all the way down to Laos, we are flattening the curve, right? And Malaysia is almost there. Uh, 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 Places like Indonesia and the Philippines are still in the works. A little bit, they're near there, but they're not quite there yet. And Singapore is a little bit misleading. A lot of those new cases, probably 99% of that, are due to migrant workers who live and work in Singapore. Like I mentioned, Singapore has a very large expat community, and a very good portion of that are migrant workers who live in dormitories that are subsidized by the government. And so they're not necessarily Singaporeans, but because they live in close quarters, the spread of the virus has been very difficult to contain. In terms of new cases with locals and expats who are not migrant workers, it's one or two cases new every week. So it's very, very manageable. And for the most part, Singapore has done a wonderful job of managing it as well. What does this mean? Earlier we saw the growth rates in GDP, but certainly, there are scenarios where, depending on the country and how likely they are to contain the virus and the situation. And you can see that, places like Vietnam, Cambodia, and China is thrown in there as as a perspective. The Philippines and Indonesia, for the most part, if they are able to manage it, will have pretty good growth. Anywhere from 2 to 4.5%. So, given these times and conditions, that's not really too bad. Now, Malaysia and Thailand have a little bit of work to do because of the scenarios there. But at most, you're looking at a negative GDP of 5% for Malaysia, and nearly that 4.5% for Malaysia. I'm sorry, -5% for Thailand, 4.5% for Malaysia. But for the most part, the main economies of Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam are continuing to drive the region. And some shifts in consumer behavior. If you're an F&B, and we have quite a few people on the call today who are in the F&B sector, you can see that consumers are reprioritizing eating at home, not only because of convenience, but also because of safety concerns and health concerns, etc. And you can see here what that has translated in terms of food delivery, the market size, and where it is projected to be by the year 2025 in the major markets. And you can see that Indonesia leads the way, along with Singapore and Thailand, and the other countries showing substantial growth all around, from Malaysia to the Philippines to Vietnam. I alluded earlier to the rental costs in this region. You can take a look here at Singapore's prime rent. Orchard area is real prime, and they have the suburban areas. But again, you can see rent here is on a per square feet. In Asia, in this part of the world, we talk a lot more on per square meter. So you would multiply that by 10. So that would be about $300 Singaporean, which would be just a little bit over 200 US dollars per square meter. And even in places like Vietnam, where again there's a distinction between CBD versus non-CBD, but the average rent between both is about 50 US dollars per month. And that's on a plus plus basis. That does not include service. It does not include tax. In Thailand, a similar situation. If you're looking at the CBD there, the figures are in baht, but if you do the math, you will find that it is anywhere from 100 to 150 US dollars per month, plus plus. So not cheap at all. So finally, this is going to be the last slide before we switch over to the Q&A. Um, Obviously, I think international brands that come to this region automatically will be viewed as premium. And so that puts a lot of pressure on margins, right? And so pricing has to be more aggressive. But the more aggressive it is, obviously, that's going to put some pressures on the margins, like we talked about. Labor costs in general are going to be cheaper, with a possible exception for Singapore, but for the most part, throughout the other 9 countries in Southeast Asia, labor costs will be down as a percentage of the P&L, but rental costs for the most part will be substantially higher. So labor and rental costs and the higher COGS tend to, if done correctly, kind of balance each other out. Businesses that require less space and have smaller formats will benefit greatly because of the expensive real estate costs here in the region. And also, if franchisors are flexible in local sourcing, that will alleviate not only a cost pressure for franchisees, but even things like import licenses and delivery schedules and delays. All that stuff can be much more manageable if more localization is allowed. Again, some of the markets like Indonesia, Malaysia need halal certification. IP registration should be one of the first steps you do as a franchisor. And hopefully, once you receive more information from Telec, which we will provide to you, perhaps there's an opportunity there to get that process rolling. Internet connectivity throughout the region, as you saw, is very high. So being able to leverage that through digital marketing, or to have systems in place for food delivery or takeaway, is especially critical, especially given the fact that consumer thoughts and inclinations are now changing, where eating at home is becoming a more significant part of their daily life. And again, things like having flexible, realistic development schedules and competitive franchise terms. Too many times I hear brands in America or the UK or Canada or Australia, the fees are too high when they are compared to brands from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, etc. Now, clearly, there are very real differences in the brands and the countries they come from, but the more flexibility you have here, will mean a higher and likelier chance of success of finding the right partners. And a lot of times, when we talk about the brands to potential investors, they're always interested in understanding, is there a support team here in the region? When we say that the support team is halfway around the world, that tends to raise eyebrows. So, do your best to either travel to the region more regularly or hire people, whether full time staff or part time staff, or maybe have consultants help you fill the gap. Those things are really going to be not only appreciated, but for some expected from franchisors that are based further away. So we are now done with the main presentations. We will bring Alan back on to the call, and we can start reviewing some of the comments. We're going to go into the Q&A mode. Okay, Junie asks, we normally expand as a single unit franchise. You mentioned area developers and master franchisees. Why? Well, the way we help our clients, and the way that many franchisors have chosen to enter this region in not only Southeast Asia but in Asia in general, it is nearly impossible to grant single unit franchisees, because then that would be too many franchisees to manage. And so a lot of the franchisors are seeking what we call area franchisees, where a single franchisee will get an exclusive territory within their country or perhaps the entire country, and they will commit to developing multiple units. Now, the only difference between an area developer versus a master franchisee is that in a master franchise, the franchisor will allow you to sub franchise and through sub franchising to scale up even faster. Do you see conversion opportunities and consolidations going forward in the short term, including rental rates dropping due to the current economic situations? Very good question, Michael. Regarding the rental rates, I'll address that first. They are dropping, but they are actually not dropping as much as you would think. A lot of the modern retail shopping centers throughout the region continue to have very high capacity. So the rates themselves are not dropping significantly. What what is happening in the short term, though, is that landlords and real estate developers are providing lots of incentives, in terms of free rents or partial payment of rents or deferred rents, etc. So they are, or even establishing a pool of advertising funds that all the tenants can share, which is provided by the real estate developers. So um, there are many things that developers are doing, and in the short term, there should be a little bit of weakness in most of these countries, but as soon as 2021 or 2022, we would expect that retail rents would continue to be where they are now. I'm sorry, not now, but pre-COVID, and possibly even higher. And a big part of that is due to the supply demand situation that you find almost everywhere throughout Southeast Asia. John asks, you talked a lot about growth, but we are concerned with the very low GDP and limited disposable income. For a premium product, is there still a market, and where? Very good questions. In fact, the population and the demographic is quite diverse, as you saw earlier in the slides as we went from country to country. With every particular franchise or brand, there is a particular market segment And there are brands that are targeting lower income consumers, right? And looking for consumers who are looking for a value proposition. So brands like Little Caesars Pizza, for example, where you can buy a $5 pizza, a large pepperoni for $5 US. That's quite a value proposition for many, many people, for many middle income people throughout Southeast Asia, right? And that middle income class is doubling every 5 or so years. And so it is a massive market. And again, if your product or service is premium, there are plenty of examples in education, in F&B, in services and retail. The LV does extremely well in Southeast Asia. Let's put it that way, right? So they sell a lot of Rolls Royce throughout Southeast Asia. So it's not necessarily that on average the incomes are lower than they are in the West, but it really depends on your specific target market. But a very good question. Here's a question from Michael again. Do you see a shift in specific countries that will be affected by the COVID shutdown in regards to investment, economic, a big shift since 2019, planning for 21 going forward, priority markets now versus the future? Wow, that's quite a list of questions. So I'm going to try and answer this as concisely as possible. Um, the countries that continue to drive ASEAN as a region are really a handful. They are countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and to some extent places like Thailand and Malaysia. And so, uh, quite a few countries, as you saw earlier in the earlier chart about COVID, are managing the curve quite well. Countries like Vietnam, for example, their national airline is asking the government to allow for international flights as early as June 1st. There is something similar happening in the Philippines with their national airlines. And recently, Thailand said that they would consider opening up their airports and international flights by the end of June. So, things are coming back. Decisions are being made week by week. Obviously, managing and flattening the curve and reducing the number of new cases is critical prior to opening the markets. But you can see that there has been a lot of progress in many of these countries. And so we would expect that Asia as a whole will get out of this sooner than the West, but specifically when and how much obviously becomes an educated guess at this point. For 2021, we expect many of these markets to be online, and for the most part, non-restrictive travel with non, you know, restrictive measures like the mandatory 14-day quarantines, etc. And again, a big part of that also is how other countries in the region are managing the COVID situation as well. How places like China, Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are handling that. And for the most part, all of those countries that were mentioned earlier are doing a fairly good job. Some need to do a little bit more, but for the most part, trending in the right direction. So priority markets, I would definitely say Vietnam, definitely the Philippines, and some of the emerging markets like Myanmar, Cambodia, but also a little bit possibly of Thailand and Indonesia as well, because we do expect those countries to come online either in Q3 or Q4 of this year. So, very good question. Junie asked, "Do you know about corporate tax laws in Vietnam?" Alan, I don't know if you want to answer this. Maybe it's in your area, but I think in general, corporate tax laws are 20%. There are special circumstances if you are in a favored industry. There are lots of incentives.
Yeah, that's right. 20% on that corporate tax. That's absolutely right, Sean. And one of the things about making sure you're registered to pay that corporate tax, that franchise registration process in Vietnam, that takes about 2 months from beginning to finish. But one of the most important, well, one of the very important parts of that franchise registration process in Vietnam is making sure that you submit that evidence of registering for the proper payment of that 2% tax.
Correct. Thank you, Alan. Appreciate that. Um, let's see here. Here's an interesting question. I see a lot of brands have expanded into Asia, but I hear that many are not doing well. Any ideas on why and how to avoid what they did wrong? This could be a really long conversation, John. So if you have, a need for a full answer, certainly contact us, and we can set up a call to do that. The short answer is it really boils down to finding the right partners. And sometimes what we find is franchisors, in their haste, probably select partners that may, after a second look, may not be the best choice. They may have some limited capabilities, they may have limited financial resources, or they may have limited consumer knowledge or access to real estate, and sometimes all of those things. And so, again, part of what we do is to give choices to our clients so that they can pick and choose the most qualified franchisee for their brand, and not just obviously the first franchisee that wants their brand. So I think in general, that's really um, uh, the way it's done. I think we have questions for maybe one or two more. So this is an interesting question. I hear developing countries like China seem to require under the table money to get things done. Is there a way to completely do this legit? Alan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
You're right, Sean. We did speak to this a little bit earlier in our presentations, and unfortunately, not just in Asia Pacific, but everywhere in the world, you're always going to find some bad apples in the mix. From a lawyer's perspective, you can always sort of ameliorate or control or manage some of that risk by, in that franchise agreement, which I'm sure all of your master franchise agreements already have these control mechanisms. Making sure that your franchisee acknowledges that bad things are not good, that bribery is bad. If you have your own sort of corporate compliance rules and regulations, you can always feel free to attach those to your franchise agreement that you're hoping to extend here in Asia Pacific. But there's always going to be bad players in anywhere in the world. But as long as you manage and sort of take on board the risks and how you control that with your franchisee, and have a good, honest conversation with your franchisee about how important it is for your business and for your brand and your company's reputation not to be tarnished by this. As long as you have that conversation with the franchisee, make sure you put that forward in the franchise agreement. That's about the best you can do.
Now, Alan, this is a great question. I have registered my brand through WIPO. Do I need to register again in Southeast Asian markets? We get asked this question lots of times, every time we talk to somebody who might become a client or is a client. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what Junie's asking about is what we call the Madrid Protocol, which is sort of like an international application platform that the World Intellectual Property Office offers. A lot of countries around the world are members of this International Madrid Protocol registration sort of process. Some countries are not. Most countries here in Southeast Asia are. Thailand is, Malaysia is, Vietnam is. Some of the more developing countries are not a part of that just yet. There are pros and cons to registering through the international pathway called Madrid, as opposed to registering in those local jurisdictions by way of their traditional sort of national trademark office registration processes. The only thing you need to make sure you do is where you are expanding your franchise business into Southeast Asia, just check to see whether or not that particular country is a member of this WIPO Madrid International Trademark Registration Protocol. If they're not, then you need to register by way of the traditional national office filings.
Thank you for that, Alan. It is a little bit past 11 p.m. our time, so I think we are ending it on time. And I want to say again, thank you to all the viewers who have participated, and thank you for your thoughtful questions. Again, our team will be following up with you with links to this recorded video as well as the presentations themselves. And then also a special thanks to Alan and Telek and Gibbons, a valued partner here with Via Franchise Consulting. Thank you very much for your participation and the education in franchising legalities across the region. And again, I would encourage you to reach out to Telek and Gibbons. They have a regional presence throughout Southeast Asia and 100-year history in Southeast Asia. And so very, very capable in providing you with the right franchise legal advice. Thank you very much. I hope you all found these presentations very helpful, and stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good day. Thank you very much.